Hi, Mills Elementary. I'm Mrs. Figueroa, the school social worker, and I'm here to read you a story called Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal, A Tale of Tattletales. This story is written by Jeanie, Franz, Ransom, and it's illustrated by Jackie Urbanovic. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class, and 19 tattletales. It all started when Jessica trot-trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. "Peter pulled my pigtail." "That must have hurt," Mrs. McNeil said. "Did you tell Peter that?" Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, "Let's see what Peter said." Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. "Jessica said you pulled her pigtail," Mrs. McNeil said. "I did not," Peter said. "Yes, you did," Jessica said. "Well, you both have the right to say how you feel," Mrs. McNeil said. "You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that." Mrs. McNeil added, "But since Jessica's tail is still attached and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now." Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming "The Farmer in the Dell." Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. "Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times." Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. "Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself by first talking to Rachel," she said. "Maybe her ears aren't working well today. Let's find out." "Stephen can't find his pink marker," Mrs. McNeil said. "Have you seen it?" "I gave it back," Rachel cried. "I can't find my pink marker." "Well, that's because you used it all up," Peter said. "You're always drawing pictures of pigs." Rachel sniffed. "For your information, those are pictures of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green?" "You know our class rule, Rachel," said Mrs. McNeil. "If you want to borrow something, ask first. That's how friends treat each other and stay friends." Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced Frankie called Sookie a fat sow. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak and clear her throat and hope she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. "I'm glad you know the class rules so well," said Mrs. McNeil. "You're right. We don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us," Mrs. McNeil said. "I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Sookie have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job," Mrs. McNeil added, "is to take care of you. That's the most important job that you can have." Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then the stampede started. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Laura looked at me. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Sam's picking his snout. Whew. The students had particularly worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. "Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new class rule to our list," Mrs. McNeil said. "A very important rule," she added. "Can anyone tell me what squealing is?" The students all started squealing, like their tails were stuck in a gate. "Not that kind of squealing," Mrs. McNeil shouted, waving her cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued, "Squealing she said, is my special word for tattling. And I know you all know what that is. Some students looked at each other. Some students looked at the floor. Other students looked up at the ceiling like there was suddenly something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeil said. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. What does it mean? Jessica asked. Well, I'm glad you asked that, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means you go up to tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems that they can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. But sometimes, Mrs. McNeil said, something happens that's bigger than kid-sized problems, like when someone is hurt or in danger, when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them or that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal because it's a big problem. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. And that's when you need to hoof it up and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned, Kate? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Carolyn's fault, Sookie said. Who's Carolyn? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Thump! Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick, call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door. Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's all our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar said. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself. It sounds like all of you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone said you knew just what to do when I got hurt. Only because you're such a great teacher, Jessica said. And you're such good listeners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. And if you have some time, your teacher has some instructions on how you can make a little pig snout. And if I see you guys wearing this around school, then I know that you read the story. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. Bye, everyone.